some debate among the German forces in late 16 and early 17 whether or not they should fall back to the line immediately. And ultimately, in the spring of 1917, when the German High Command learned that the Allies under Nivelle were going to be launching these major attacks, the decision was finally taken on the German side that it would be just as well to withdraw most of the German forces back to the new line, the Siegfried Line or the Hindenburg Line, whichever you want to call it. And this was essentially complete by early April. The operation was known as Operation Alberic. And in the process of undertaking this withdrawal, the Germans destroyed any infrastructure in between the old front line and the new front line, that is between the red line and the purple line, and left all kinds of obstacles in the way for the Allies. They mined the roads and put all kinds of traps and demolitions and things in place to make it difficult to pass through this area. So essentially, if we're going to use a boxing analogy here, a very simplistic one, the Germans were able to leap backward out of the way before these heavy punches were even delivered in Nivelle's so-called spring offensive of 1917. Now, at this stage, incidentally, if anybody has seen the film 1917, the premise of which I find questionable, but we don't need to get into that right now. It is set. Apparently, it is meant to be taking place in the immediate aftermath of the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line, or at least that's my understanding of the film. But we'll leave that alone for the time being. In any case, once Nivelle had already put his planning in motion for these attacks, he didn't make any adjustments to the overall strategic scheme, even with the knowledge that German forces had withdrawn to this new line by early April, the Hindenburg Line and or the Siegfried Line, whatever you want to call it. So, as a consequence, the first two phases of Nivelle's spring offensive were launched, the Battle of Arras and the Second Battle of the Aisne, on the dates that I've shown here. And so the Battle of Arras was the British Expeditionary Force component, and this encompassed an advance that comprised two full British armies, the first and the third, on the Arras front, and it included, for example, the Canadian Corps and its attack against Vimy Ridge. So Vimy Ridge was actually part of the larger Battle of Arras in April 1917. Now, all across the British front, whether we're talking about the First Army or the Third Army, the initial advance, which took place between the 9th and the 12th of April, was really quite successful in terms of capturing ground. Vimy Ridge had completely fallen, for example, by the 12th. And that was on the First Army front where the Canadian Corps was operating. But further to the south, the Third Army troops, British Army troops, actually advanced considerably further than Vimy Ridge, and what up until that point was probably the deepest advance of any offensive on the Western Front. The problem is that once the Germans were able to bring reinforcements into the sector, they were effectively able to stop any further advances beyond mid-April. And while the initial gains were impressive in terms of the ground captured and the tactics which were employed, they didn't lead to any strategic consequences because there was no major breakthrough such as the one that Nivelle was hoping for that could drive off in the direction of Saint-Quentin, for instance. And one of the reasons the Germans were able to reinforce relatively effectively is because when they withdrew their troops to the Siegfried Line in Operation Alberic, they were withdrawing to a shorter line that therefore helped them to economize on soldiers because there was less distance, less length of front line to defend. So they could concentrate then the extra troops in areas where any threats might materialize. And furthermore, for the British forces at the Battle of Arras, despite the early successes, the casualty rates were catastrophic. If you look at the numbers of British and Empire troops who were killed or wounded per day in battle at the Battle of Arras, they were higher than the Battle of the Somme from 1916, and they were higher even than the bloody Battle of Passchendaele, which was going to come later in 1917. And if we focus, for example, on the Canadian Corps by itself, in about 4 days, it lost 11,000 men, of which about 3,500 or so were killed. And to this day, including the Second World War, the Battle of Vimy Ridge is arguably the most expensive Canadian battle in all of our history. We've never, in any other situation, lost that many soldiers killed and wounded in such a short period of time. And it was largely because of these heavy losses and a drop-off in voluntary enlistments that the Robert Borden government at home in Ottawa finally decides to follow through with the introduction of compulsory military service, and the political debates which follow that legislation, the Military Service Act of 1917, nearly tore the country apart. And probably even up until the present time, there has never been such a divisive issue in Canadian politics. So the northern sort of the northern component of the Nivelle offensive, although initially successful, is a strategic failure. It's just that simple. And essentially the same thing happens down on the southern front along the Chemin des Dames, where the Second Battle of the Aisne is launched about a week after the Battle of Arras. And in this French component of the big 1917 spring offensives, again, there is initially some ground gained that is of tactical significance, but the French, just like the British and Canadians, suffer heavy casualties. By the 9th of May, after 2 or 3 weeks of fighting, their losses exceed 130,000 men. And after 30 days of fighting, they have made an advance of less than 4 miles. So they're nowhere close to reaching their objective at Saint-Quentin. It's impossible to trap any German soldiers in any case because they've withdrawn to the Siegfried Line. So the third attack from the French troops coming from the southwest never comes. And in fact, in the aftermath of the Second Battle of the Aisne, the French army sort of collapses into a state of mutiny, where significant components in the French army simply refuse to undertake any further attacks. They refuse to take any further attacks until and unless the French government offers some concessions to make the lives of the soldiers a little bit easier. For example, they wanted better food, they wanted more time on leave, etc., etc. Now, this was not a refusal of the French army to continue fighting, but could be considered more correctly as a sort of sit-down strike. The troops held their positions, but they wouldn't go on the offensive again until these concessions were made. And in fact, the French government largely did concede in providing what the mutineers asked for, because there was little alternative, given the strength of angry sentiment amongst French soldiers who were simply getting tired of fighting in offensives where the gains that they were making were not proportional to the costs of the offensives in terms of killed and wounded French soldiers. So what we find then by May 1917 is that the Allied offensives for the spring have completely collapsed. They have made no significant strategic breakthrough whatsoever. And in fact, Nivelle very quickly loses his job as commander-in-chief of the French forces because he miserably failed to deliver on any of his promises. And we return then for the rest of 1917, putting things simply, to a straightforward, ongoing attritional struggle, which will play out especially in the Battle of Passchendaele in the autumn of 1917 in Belgium. But the only real consequence of this fighting in the spring was to compare uh, Allied losses to German losses, which, like the 1916 fighting, were probably roughly in the same on the same order of magnitude. It's just that the Germans could increasingly less afford, to replace these casualties, whereas the Allies still had further reserves of reinforcements that they could call on. So, if we want to be able to make some comparisons between fighting on the Western Front in the First World War and the Second World War, probably the best way to do it would be to look at 1916 and 1917, as we have done, and then to compare that with the campaigns that the Allies were fighting in Northwest Europe during the second half of 1944 and the very early part of 1945, roughly up until they crossed the Rhine in Germany. And then later on, we can compare the final campaigns of 1945 with the victory offensives that the Allies fought in the last few months of 1918. This is probably the most sensible way to go about it. So let's begin then with the Battle of Normandy, which was fought between early June, and late August 1944. Last week we talked about the preparations for the amphibious assault, Operation Neptune, which was the sort of amphibious component of the larger Allied invasion of Normandy, known as Operation Overlord. And we don't have time to discuss in any detail how the landings themselves played out, although on balance the results of the landings were better than Allied planners had hoped for, particularly because they suffered fewer casualties than were expected, and because they were able to secure viable bridgeheads on the 6th and 7th of June, which was the most important immediate requirement for Operation Overlord. Yes, there were some very difficult experiences on the 6th of June, particularly on Omaha Beach, where the U.S. 1st and 29th Divisions landed. But all things considered, given the complexity of the operation and the number of troops involved and the strength of the German offensives, the landings were more successful than anybody could reasonably have hoped for. Now, we every year, I think, around the time of June 6th, we read about the Normandy landings and Operation Overlord, but there tends to be fairly little written in the popular sphere, at least, about the Battle of Normandy that followed Operation Overlord, and upon which the course of the war in the West really depended in 1944. Because it was one thing for Allied troops to gain a bridgehead in the Normandy Peninsula, but then after that, it was up to the Allied forces in Normandy to break out of the Normandy Peninsula and to begin to drive on in an easterly direction toward occupied Belgium and Holland, as well as Germany itself. So the landings themselves, although they represented a really monumental achievement, this was really only the beginning. The real battle, per se, to liberate northwestern Europe comes after the landings during the Battle of Normandy in June, July, and August of 1944. And to put things in simplest terms, in this campaign that lasted roughly 2 to 3 months, the Allies succeeded at nothing less than destroying two German field armies, the 7th Army and the 15th Army. And I don't think that enough credit is given to the Allied forces in Normandy for the magnitude of this achievement. We probably all know something about the destruction of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad, And in many respects, the Allied victory in Normandy in 1944 was like the Stalingrad of the West, because